Everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So first of all, I want to thank Ben for that nice introduction and thank the Linda Hall Library not only for having me speak to you today, but for having me for the last 6 weeks as a fellow here. I've had a great time and learned a lot, and I'm going to share some of the research I've done here with you. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time that this talk, which I've given before, is usually pretty nice and tight, but there's going to be some kind of what I did with my summer vacation elements to it. So I'm going to kind of warn you about that ahead of time. I do want to introduce you to this interdisciplinary research network we call the Maintainers, and put forward some of the ideas we've been playing with. But before I do that, I want to kind of tell you the story of how I got here. So the Maintainers is one of these things that literally started off as a joke. I talk to my therapist a lot about why most of my projects start out of frustration. We haven't figured it out, but it's true. This book drove my friend Andy and I crazy for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to go into too deeply. But while Andy was in the shower, he came up with a joke, and it was that we should create a counter volume to be called The Maintainers, How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Created Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. We started playing around with this on the internet, like on Twitter and blogging and such, and we got encouragement to go ahead with it, so we held a conference at Stevens Institute of Technology called The Maintainers. Then we held a second one the next year. The day that we held the first one, we also published this article called Hail the Maintainers. And then something odd happened. The news of our academic history of technology conference went viral. That does not happen to historians of technology or historians at all, generally. It got picked up by The Atlantic and The Guardian, Le Monde. I got invited to give a talk at the Sydney Opera House. There was a Freakonomics episode. We got invited to write for the New York Times. And then this last fall, we got a book deal to write this book called The Innovation Delusion. So people ask me, like, how do you do this thing, like create something like The Maintainers? And I'm like, have friends come up with jokes in the shower. There's like there's no reproducing what happened. There's no secret sauce here. So what I want to do today is run through 3 sections. The first is I'm going to give a brief history of innovation speak. I usually want to give this talk, I spend a lot of time beating up on innovation. I'm going to go light on that because I want to introduce you to what we're doing with the Maintainers. And then really what I want to focus on is what I've been looking at as the history of maintenance while I've been here. And I want to share some of those sources with you. Oh, and this is just to remind me, you're going to see throughout my talk, I'm going to show you sources, and if it says LHL next to it, I found it here. Okay, a brief history of innovation speak and its consequences. We like to talk about the difference between innovation and innovation speak. Innovation is the process of introducing new things in society and how that happens. Innovation speak is how we've come to talk about that and use the word innovation. I want to say that those two things are not even related to each other sometimes. And what I want to tell you about is the history of innovation speak. So innovation is a fascinating word. Like all words, it has its own history. It started as heresy, right? In the church-dominated Middle Ages, to innovate was to introduce new religious ideas or rites, which could get you burned at the stake. Or killed in all kinds of nice ways. So in 1548, the King of England issued a proclamation against those that do with innovate. So our question then is, how does this thing that could get you killed turn into something we're all supposed to aspire to be, something we're supposed to train up our children to be by giving them like codapillars and send them to coding camp and whatever? What happened? The story is complicated. I think it has a lot to do with the history of industrial civilization. Even in the 18th century, to be an inventor was not a role that was looked highly upon, right? It was not something that got you social status. But in the 19th century, as you know, the railroad and all these fancy technologies start being introduced, social status starts to shift around engineering and invention. So that by the mid-19th century, you have authors like Samuel Smiles writing biographies that are celebrating engineers and inventors. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, you have cults of invention around figures like Edison, Graham Bell. You have Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, and these other magazines and journals that really celebrate invention. And yet, the word innovation only really takes off after World War II. I'm going to use a number of these through my talk. They're Google Ngrams. If you Google Ngram and click on the link, it'll bring up a little tool, and what you do is you put a word or phrase in it, and it searches Google Books to show you the historical usage patterns of that word or phrase. So what this is showing you is from 1800 to 2000, and what it's saying is it's after 1940 that the use of innovation really takes off. And the steepest periods are in the 60s and in the 90s. So the question is, what's happening? Lots of things are leading to this change, but my colleagues and I really believe that economists are playing a central role. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, some economists begin to look at statistical data of economic growth, and the factors that were supposed to explain economic growth, like capital and labor, simply could not explain all the growth. And so Robert Solow, in this essay, Technical Change and the Aggregate Production Function, hypothesizes that it's technological change that's creating the growth, and they start calling it innovation. And so we see in the 60s, the term technological innovation just shoots off as policymakers, economists, and all these business people are trying to think about technology, how it's contributing to the economy, and how to generate more of it. All right, here's some sources from Linda Hall Library. In the mid-1960s, you start seeing government agencies and other organizations like the National Academy of Sciences start putting out publications on innovation. Here's one, Technology Transfer and Innovation from the National Science Foundation. What's fascinating, and this is from '67, what's fascinating is that when we get into them, I mean, they really show the ideology of innovation that we still have with us today. It's really being kind of generated at this moment. Although it obviously has earlier kind of tendrils that go back to the 19th century. Here's one little selection that I wanted to highlight. And the sentence that sticks out for me, I should have highlighted it literally, is for the most part, conferees, people at the conference that this thing was based on, tacitly accepted the general assumptions that innovation per se is good and on balance beneficial to the economy, and that a deeper understanding of the process is needed in order to further it. So the part I want to highlight here is the assumption that innovation is inherently good. It's just a good, we need more of it. We'll come back to this idea. Here's another source, Education for Innovation by Daniel DeSimone. And here's something, this is just fascinating to me because people still say this stuff. It says, an engineering school that merely imparts information is an expensive waste. And it goes on to say that creative individuals are oppressed by engineering education and the real world of invention and innovation is foreign to it. Now, this is a striking thing to say in the 50s and 60s when technologies are changing rapidly and leading to economic growth. You'd say, are engineers working in the 50s and 60s not creative? Are they not? No, they're definitely creative, right? But what you see with these innovation folks is that you have to create the perception of crisis that they know the key to information, or creativity, I'm sorry, right? You're not creative. They've got the special key to make you the creative individual. And we'll come back to this too. Finally, here's another report I looked at is Technological Innovation, its Environment and Management. This is from the US Department of Commerce. And here I want to highlight that they play up the economic dimensions. Why should government have an interest in invention and innovation? The answer is that invention and innovation lie at the heart of the process by which America has grown and renewed itself. And then in the bottom paragraph, they cite that Solow essay that I showed you. So what these people at the NSF are doing, or at Commerce, they're citing these economists saying, this is the key to creating economic growth. We have to figure out how to get more innovation. Within a decade, the notion of innovation policy, the phrase really takes off, and this puts it in clearer and clearer terms that the goal of government through whether, depending on your political philosophy, for Republicans, it's through tax breaks and deregulation. That's supposed to generate innovation. For Democrats, it's like increasing science funding and the kind of slew of policies they would create. But the idea here is government should be generating innovation. That's one of its main goals. Now, about the same time that innovation policy, the notion is being created, you see the first books on Silicon Valley being published. And without fail, the early books on Silicon Valley are how-to books for creating the next Silicon Valley in you name it town. This has traveled all over the world. They try to create the next Silicon Valley in India or Missouri, or when I gave a talk in Australia, they were talking about Kangaroo Valley, which was going to be the Silicon Valley there. And I think we can keep going, but I'll kind of cut off the history there, is to say, like, from the 90s to the present, with the rise of Silicon Valley culture and the kind of tech, leader culture of Musk and Peter Thiel and these kind of characters, I think there's like this self-reinforcing culture where we hear innovation more and more, along with, killer app, big data, disruption, angel investors, and all these kinds of buzzwords that we hear so often. Okay, so who cares? Like, maybe innovation's great, maybe innovation speak is great. Why should we be skeptical of innovation? Now, the first thing I want to ask is, does innovation speak lead to innovation? I think there's real questions here about whether talking about innovation leads to innovation. One irony of innovation policy is that there's a number of good studies on Robert Gordon from Northwestern and other economists have shown that the most profound period of economic growth in the United States and technological change was between 1870 and 1970. All right, you have automobiles, aviation, electricity, chemicals, plastics, computing, electronics, we just keep going on and on. And when we talk about innovation post, say, especially 1980, we're primarily talking about digital technology, okay? And so there's an irony here that if Gordon and others are right, that most of the innovation came before 1970, and yet it's only after 1970 we've been talking about innovation all the time. It's like, apparently they didn't need the word innovation in 1920 to innovate. I don't know how it worked, but they didn't need the word back then, right? And there's more to it. I think while there's real doubts about whether talking this way leads to meaningful change, I think we're also damaging institutions in the name of innovation. So, I work in higher ed. I'm very worried about what's happening to universities right now, where we view students as customers, and we put more and more pressure, not on me, thank God, I'm like in a humanities department, but more and more pressure on engineering and science faculty, especially to pull in money, to patent. They're trying to make universities basically houses of innovation. And I think it does damage, but say you don't care about universities, that's fine, whatever. I think you also see it in business. Here's an example. General Electric decided a couple years ago that it was become like a new startup culture. They're trying to become more Silicon Valley-like. And this isn't 3 days ago. This was last spring. Now, they're in huge problems. This attempt to revolutionize their culture and become innovators and startups just did not work, right? It was bad leadership. I think there's also real questions about whether Silicon Valley is a place that we should hope to emulate. Here's a homeless camp in Silicon Valley. It's a tremendously unequal place. There's all these, I feel like I used to have to make a case for beating up on Silicon Valley, but within the last year, there's really been a turn in the popular media where Silicon Valley is just like the whipping boy or child, or however we want to put that today, where, the culture of these corporations and such, they work people to death, and, it's not really clear that we should, want to make Kansas City Silicon Valley. Don't do it. This is crack cocaine. According to strict economic definitions of innovation, crack cocaine was a major innovation in the 1980s. It disrupted good cocaine, like blow, right? It pushed that to the side. It was cheap. Lots of people wanted it. They would do almost anything to get their hands on it. There was, risky entrepreneurship around it called drug dealing. Like everything about this literally fits the real economic definition of innovation. Here's Walter White, meth entrepreneur innovator. Now, and lest you think I'm only joking, Enron was called the most innovative company in America for 6 years in a row before it was discovered that it was all fraud. Now, what's my point? Obviously, I'm kind of like being ironic and making jokes, but the point here is that we tend to treat innovation like it's an inherent good in itself, when really it's about, innovation just means introducing new business processes, new technologies that can be good or bad. We've caused lots of harm, by introducing toxics, for instance. And so I think innovation speak treats technology as an end in itself when it can never be more than a means to an end. And so then, therefore, we have to, if we really want to live in culture together, we have to talk about what ends we're trying to get to. And that can be very hard in our kind of pluralistic culture where we come from different religious backgrounds, different political backgrounds. Our Congress isn't working so well in the last couple of years, I've heard. So this can be hard, but I think that this is, it's better to have those kinds of conversations than to pretend that technology alone is going to save us or that it's inherently good. So that's enough. I can go on. I can beat up on innovation. I can make Clayton Christensen jokes. We can do all kinds of, we can go on for a long time, but I will cut it off there and try to introduce you to some of the ideas in the maintainers. So the maintainers, we always say that the maintainers is not an innovation. We draw on a rich heritage within the history of technology and other fields of people who've looked at upkeep and maintenance for a long time. This is Ruth Cowan's wonderful book, More Work for Mother, The Ironies of Household Technology from the Open Hearth to the Microwave, which looks at women's housework, much of which is focused on just keeping things going, right, on maintaining the household. Famously in this book, Cowan discovers that so-called labor-saving technologies like washing machines and vacuums and such that were supposed to save women time, they actually ended up cleaning more because as the technologies were introduced, cleanliness standards went up, both for reasons of appearance and reasons of hygiene, so that women ended up doing more housework even though the technologies were saved effort. Here's another book, The Shock of the Old by David Edgerton. Edgerton's a big influence on us, and he has a chapter in this book on maintenance. I'd suggest everyone should check out both of these books. Instead of going on, I just want to boil down like 3 main points of the maintainers, and then I'll get into the history of maintenance. So the first is that technology is not innovation. I've already kind of gotten at this in the talk, but usually I kind of write people through a guided meditation of their day. Say like, where'd you wake up this morning? Was it in a bed? That's a very old technology. The blankets over you are very old technologies. If you use the restroom today, most of the technologies that you interface with there are very old technologies. And most of the efforts or most things we do in our life, certainly I love my cell phone and Spotify and all these cool apps and stuff. But most of the technologies around us are pretty old, and more human effort goes into keeping these technologies going than goes into introducing new technologies. Now, if you're an engineer or scientist and you like quantitative arguments, not qualitative ones, that's fine. We can do that too. We don't have good macroeconomic measures of maintenance as a portion of effort in the economy because our surveys don't get at it. But we do have good industry level data. And the one we like to highlight is in software, about 70% of software budgets go into maintenance. All right, this is supposed to be like the cutting edge technology. This is Silicon Valley. Most of those people working at Amazon are maintainers. Okay, only 8% or so is spent on design. Infrastructure is super important when it comes to thinking about everyday technologies. You know, like the systems like sewers, electricity, Wi-Fi, you know, the internet, all these systems around us are absolutely essential, and yet we often take them for granted. You know, some people like to say they're invisible to us because we pay so little attention to them. And if you like to pay attention to the infrastructure report card that the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out, I always get my acronyms confused with that one. You know, we're always getting near a failing grade in infrastructure. So this last one, we got a D+ for infrastructure in the United States. And the last thing is that thinking through the maintainers leads us to think about the maintainers, the people in our society who are often not paid attention to, that just keep everything going. You know, we think about where they fit in within the status hierarchies of our organizations. How much are they paid? Sometimes it's very good. Sometimes it's not very good, like janitorial staff. Yeah, and it just leads us to think about who's doing what work, and why is it that when I tell my students, draw a picture, or, you know, I give them assignments like, write down the name of some innovators on these Post-it notes and then go stick it on the board, it's always white guys, right? Well, our society is more than white men, so who are these, what are these other folks doing? I feel like I had something else I wanted to say there, but I'll keep going. All right, so now I want to get into, this is one of those projects I told you that I just we were making a joke and all of a sudden we had a project on our hand and people were like, what is the history of maintenance? We're like, we'll get back to you in 2 years. Let me go to Linda Hall Library and I'll figure it out. So that's what I've been doing this summer. In an essay that I'm happy to share with you, we go back and look at maintenance in ancient cultures. Pyramids were maintained. Cato the Elder, the Roman leader, bragged about the maintenance work he did on the sewer system there. So maintenance has always been a part of culture. You know, we can talk about the maintenance work that spiders do on their webs. I mean, it's a part of life, right? But we believe that there's something happened, a change came in with the history of industrialization, industrial capitalism. And for that reason, it's helpful to think about how things worked before the rise of industrial capitalism. This is a film, a documentary, Gunsmith of Williamsburg. It's on YouTube. I use it to teach my students about the history of mass production. And what this documentary shows is a guy, Wallace Gunsler, making a rifle from scratch, from raw materials, from start to finish. He makes the whole rifle, and then he shoots it at the end. It's a great movie. My students think it's boring, so I just show them snippets, but I encourage you to watch it. And what stands out for the purposes of this talk is that Gunsler not only makes the rifle, he makes all of his own tools, and he maintains all of his own tools. And if you think about blacksmiths, they too were making things, creating things, repairing things, maintaining things. Before the rise of industrial capitalism, when we look at most places, the maintainers and the makers, producers, are the same human beings. We see the same thing when we look at households. So this is a great famous book, A Midwife's Tale by Laura Thatcher Ulrich. This is about the life of a midwife from 1785 to 1812. When you look at Martha Ballard's story, you see that, you know, she's producing in the fields, she's maintaining things in the house. There's no division of labor during this period. Everyone's doing everything. But that changes later. And I don't want to overly stereotype. I think we could find places in history where there are maintainer roles. Okay, I'm just saying in general, I think we can make an argument that something changes. So let me tell you about one group. This is the Roadmasters and Association of America. They formed in 1883. They're an organization of railroad maintainers. Okay? I think that if we look at earlier journals in America, like the Franklin Journal of the Franklin Institute, we'd find people. I know we find people maintaining things, but this is a professional organization focused on maintaining the way. They're the people who maintain the roadbed of the railroad. This is one of the first presidents, just to let you know what a roadmaster looks like during this time. He looks like that guy. The roadmasters had very high opinions of themselves. This is a little more text heavy than most of my talks because I'm still in the synthesis period. But let me just read this. The sovereigns of empires, the chiefs and presidents of republics, with a vast multitude of their followers, entrust their lives to its mighty power, the railroads, while the management of this great factor in the world's progress must carry the dread responsibility of this burden, thus confided to its keeping. At the very foundation of this responsibility is the integrity of the road department, which means it's all about us, baby, right? The maintainers are keeping all this whole thing going. And I think that as soon as you find people making this kind of we're the most important argument, you know that you found a profession, right? That's like lawyers say it, doctors say it. That's what a profession is. You make this kind of argument. The first president, in one of his opening speech, he says that it's not good for man to be alone, which is what God says right before he creates Eve. But what his point was that these roadmasters should get together and share the best thoughts and learn from each other, and the most worthy theories of in each individual become the common property of all. So this is what they're trying to do. So what kind of ideas are they trying to share? Well, here's the kind of thing that they write about in this journal. They share lists of the standard tools that should be on every work site, right? Because they're trying to come up with what are the best practices for maintaining the railway. So they're sharing lists of tools, for instance. These are all the tools that you should have around here. They also share philosophy. This is one of my favorite things. On the subject of ditching, I will relate an anecdote told of one old engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is supposed to be one of the best railroads in America today and perhaps the world. A young man came to him to learn the business of engineering. He told him to go over the line and see that the road was ditched. And in about 6 months, the young man came back and said that the road was ditched. He said to the young engineer, go back and ditch the road again. The ditching of the road properly is something that is never finished. So they get kind of like Buddhist or something going on at these meetings, very deep. A sense of scale, at this point, by 1897, railroads owned 240,000 miles of track, and they had 180,000 track workers, 20,000 foremen, 2,000 roadmasters. This is a big deal. And maintenance is eating 17 to 25% of their budgets. They're also eating an incredible amount of natural resources, so that in 1885, they had laid 575 million wooden cross ties, okay? They required 75 million ties a year just to keep it repaired, and 13 to 14 million a year for new construction. So they were eating 10% annually of the forest that they had set aside for this purpose at this point. So this is a massive undertaking. This is very hard on workers. This is not where you wanted to work. In Georgia, they started track workers at about 75%. This is about a time where you could make $2.50 to $2.75 being like a baker in Boston. Okay, they're starting them off at 75 cents. And one roadmaster explained that he purposely paid meager wages to each worker, and another asked, you will make him so poor that he cannot get away. And he's like, yeah, that's the point. Basically, I want to keep them on paupers' wages. They also had lots of racist and kind of ethnicist ideas. They said, we can't make workers out of Mexicans or Italians. They said Mexicans, Italians, Eastern Europeans were not men of any intelligence. So they're constantly griping about the quality of the available workforce. This has not changed in the United States. That's still happening today. You'd also think, you might have heard the song John Henry before, but John Henry is a track worker. That's what the story's about. There's a really good book on John Henry by Scott Nelson. And one of the things he points out is John Henry was a prisoner who was forced to work on the track. And in the South, the roadmasters would pick their best workers and give them cocaine to make them work harder and faster and, I guess, feel good. And so, this is a kind of very exploitative system. Now, the reason I'm highlighting the labor side of this in this story is because I can get it out of these journals. For the rest of the time, you're not going to see any workers, because what Linda Hall really collects is science and engineering journals. So it's mostly the management side of the story. So what I'm going to show you for the rest of the talk is about management. By the way, the Roadmasters and Maintenance Way Association still exists. It's called ARENA. I'm going to speed up a little. These are, if you look, the reason I got excited to come here is I looked at Linda Hall's catalog, and I pumped in the word maintenance, and then I ordered by date, earliest first going forward. And what I saw was the emergence of technology. First was the railroad, then was electricity, then was roads, then was telephones. You know, it just went on and on chronologically. Because as you think, as you create these systems, you got to maintain them, right? And so, you know, in 1891, my friend Ben here, with his millions, could think of, like, why not just start up a telephone system in Dubuque, Iowa, or wherever, right? And so there were how-to books about how to set up these systems, and they often highlighted maintenance. So you can see the subtitle is a practical treatise on fitting up and maintenance. And I actually have that book in the other room. You can look at it. Engineers. One of the engineers' favorite things to do at parties is create standards. They love standards. So like passionate about standards. These are some standards that Linda Hall has. I pulled this one out for you guys to look at. It's maintenance of way standards from the Southern Railway system. And just to give you an example, here's a standardized maintenance sign. So the maintenance of way had their own standards. Okay. Another thing I'm interested in this story is the rise of new maintenance-oriented roles. I think that's what's happening here, right? there's a new role within society. These guys identify as maintainers, and you know they have a kind of class consciousness. They're going to hang out together because they see each other in each other. But we can see a lot of other examples during this time. We can see like the word janitor takes off during this period, and janitorial. It was a word that was created to kind of give more status to janitors. They created their own technical standards, actually, like janitorial engineering standards. We also see during this period words like repairman and handyman take off in, you know, the, say, 1900 and 1930s. And there is actually places where people identify as maintainers. So I hang out at this Facebook page called Maintainer Humor, which is Air Force maintainers. They mostly make fun of pilots. It's very bawdy. If you're easily offended, don't go on there. It's bad. Here's a tame one they do. Maintainers out of basic training. This is my buddy Bill Ashworth. This is you. Maintainers out of basic training, He-Man. Maintainers after 5 years, I'm tired, boss. I'm tired, I feel the pain. So, you know, this is the kind of thing. They're cheering each other up. Quick aside about domestic maintenance. Repairman, handyman. There's some good collections here of, this is a source I found kind of LHL because I found out about this through a bibliography here. This is a National Bureau of Standards thing on the care and repair of the home. And my joke about this thing, which I found a couple weeks, is this publication is clearly meant to scare the bejesus out of you. It's like, don't buy a home. Do you see all those systems you have to take care of? That's just like intimidation mode or something. But there's also nice publications. I have this on a cart there. We can grab this. This is interestingly published by two women from Iowa State College. And I learned about this through a colleague's work, Amy Bix's work. And this is basically how to maintain household equipment. Notice the women's hands here. This is a book by women for women about how to keep up the home. Contrast that with another book I have out back there, The Complete Home Handyman's Guide from 1948. I just love all of this. I get nostalgic, and I wasn't alive for like 20 or 30 years, or 30 years. And there's this very masculine guy using a drill press there. So men and women's home maintenance. Okay, and then the other story I've been able to tell, this is an important story that I kind of had a sense of, but I haven't actually able to see it here at Linda Hall Library, is I'm very interested in the development of how maintenance thinking changes, especially within corporations. So the notion of preventive maintenance, which you probably have all heard, didn't always exist. So where does it come from? I think one source is that in the 20s and 30s, you have the rise of what's called a maintenance engineer. They have a journal, and they publish articles called like preventive maintenance. So they're trying to put this idea out there, and the idea is we shouldn't just be reactive and repair things when they break. We should figure out how to work maintenance into production so we never shut the plant down, right? We can be much more efficient if we do it that way. And during this period, they're publishing this is a kind of system for organizing preventive maintenance. And they have nice pictures like this. Maintenance is a market. There's people who are selling to them. Then by the 60s, you have maintenance consultants going around trying to, this is also from Linnell Hall Library, teaching people how to do maintenance better. They look like, this is what consultants should look like in the early 1960s, is like these very square white guys. Like clearly, these guys are experts. Interestingly, they worked at places like Bell Labs and Western Electric, and both of them worked for the Navy. A lot of this thinking is created in the US military. And the thinking goes back and forth between corporations and the military. The next step in thinking is predictive maintenance. So this is how we use technologies to see when things are going wrong with machines. A lot of it has to do with figuring out what machines are vibrating badly, because that's a sign that things are going wrong. And eventually, they create these things called computerized maintenance management systems, which are these computer programs they use to organize things like maintenance and repair and predictive maintenance. Now, we think of these two firms as disruptive firms. Netflix put Blockbuster out of business, and Amazon's put a whole bunch of businesses out of business. But both of them have extremely great reliability and maintenance engineering programs. They're cutting edge when it comes to maintenance. Netflix especially, think about it, they compete through quality of service, uptime, because it's so reliable when you turn it on, and that's because it's so well maintained. I'm going to skip forward a couple, because I want to end with infrastructure. So here's a question. Does the development of maintenance thinking mean we've made progress when it comes to maintenance? Not necessarily, and definitely not everywhere. There was a story told at a maintenance conference I went to by this guy, and he talked about the Billy Bob method at the plant, which is like a guy with a radio on his belt, and someone says, Billy Bob, we got a problem down here, right? So like there's still lots of capitalist enterprises that are organized in that way. And he said at that firm where he was working at, they actually had a computerized maintenance management software package sitting in an office on a shelf. They just hadn't used it because there was no one around to do it, right? So you can't assume that we've made progress everywhere. And progress certainly is occurring when it comes to public maintenance. So when you put in crumbling infrastructure, you mostly get pictures of Minnesota and the bridge collapse there. But I think it's a discourse throughout our society. We think about Detroit, for instance. This is the line between Detroit and its neighboring suburb, Grosse Pointe Park. And the way I experienced was a lack of maintenance on one side of that line. And I want to end up soon here, but you can also see the history of worries of deferred maintenance and maintenance. So in the 1970s, we started putting less money towards maintenance. Maintenance costs were also ballooning when the economy was tanking. And eventually you have the creation of these reports that started coming out in the 80s and into the 90s, like this one, which was the first place to give us an infrastructure report card saying we're tanking when it comes to our public infrastructure because we're not putting enough money into it, which eventually led to this this infrastructure report card. One guy I like to think with is this man named Charles Marone who lives in Minnesota, and he tries to get at what's wrong with our infrastructure scene. And what he points out is that localities, when they get federal grants, the federal grants support building infrastructure, but not the maintenance. The localities are signing up to do maintenance, and they never have the money to do it. And so he highlights one example, Lafayette, Louisiana, where there was a replacement cost of the infrastructure of $32 billion. The total tax base of Louisiana was just $16 billion. So they had twice as much infrastructure as they had tax base. And instead of this being like an exception that turns out to be the rule when you look at the United States. So there's a lot of reasons our infrastructure is messed up, including because we're not putting enough federal money to it, I would argue, but it's also about this kind of unwisdom about our maintenance practices. So ultimately, the goal of the book I'm writing is to ask something like, what if we developed a more realistic way of thinking and talking about technology? And what if it included something like a maintenance mindset that's sensible about our maintenance need, including planning future infrastructure, right? What if we took those costs into account? And to understand this and start to answer this, I think we also have to understand the history of maintenance and the history of maintaining infrastructure. And for that, I had to come to Linda Hall Library. Thank you.
Right, we have time for a few questions. Raise your hand, I'll come by with the microphone. Yes.
Must have some ideas on solutions to some of these issues. For example, Washington, D.C., and they had this fabulous subway system, which is, and it's beautiful, very helpful, but it's falling apart. They can't maintain it.
Yeah.
And somehow, you must have some ideas of whether we should be putting funds in place when they're allocated, when these structures are made, put in even trust funds, I suppose, to maintain them. The military thinks this thing through to some extent, and when they design an airplane, they look at
Maintainability.
how maintaining it is, and they try to get that down. So where are we going with this?
I think the answer is, it's a complex problem, so the answer has to be complex. I've heard trust funds. I also think that localities need to, right now they count infrastructure as an asset, and they need to count it as a liability in terms of accounting, because you're basically agreeing to pay for it forever. I think that I mean, personally, it depends on your philosophy of the federal debt, but I think we should put more money into maintenance instead of building new stuff. And the other issue is local governance issues. Like the DC Metro, the problem is you have all these localities that are a part of it, and yet you cannot get them together to create a solution, right? And they don't want to raise taxes. So unless you do something like the trust fund you discussed, it's very unlikely that they're going to come together to create a solution. So I think it's going to have to be more like a bullet list of solutions to even approximate a solution than one magic bullet.
So my question is about as humans, as we are evolving in our ecosystem of like supported, or the canvas of technology there being so abundant, the trajectory of maintenance. So for example, you gave examples from the railroads, the roads, whatever. If a road is bad, we can create a detour. Even today, we do that thing all over Kansas City. You can see that. But if a website is down, there's no detour. So in the times to come, all the usual suspects like AR, VR, MR, whatever the technologies we have, as we start living digitally and virtually and Second Life and Third Lives, the maintenance is easy and difficult as well as so. I don't know whether it's a question or not, but I think the trajectory of maintenance is very convoluted and complex at the moment. That's how I see. So what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical that society's changing as quick as the kind of most vocal digital advocates want to pretend it is, and that our lives are changing that fast. But I think that there are, there's still a lot of maintenance involved in these digital technologies, as I've already argued. And I think the issue is that when, whether it's transhumanism or the singularity or whatever vision of technological futures people are playing with, maintenance isn't factored at all. It's just not, it's not discussed. I had a student give a paper on transhumanism and people altering their bodies with technologies in a seminar this past semester, and that was his point, is that there's no discourse of maintenance within that conversation. Even though when we look at people who are already putting technologies in their bodies, there's all kinds of maintenance involved. And really deep questions about whether insurance is going to cover it or not, right? So I think what I'm trying to say, I don't know which one of those futures is going to come, but maintenance is always going to be there. It's not going to go away.
Talking about innovation and maintenance. Innovation would be the Hubble telescope. And of course, they had several maintenance missions to that. Well, now we have the James Webb telescope that's a decade behind schedule,
Hmm.
thousands of percent over cost, no way to ever get up to it once it's in orbit to maintain it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a fascinating history of maintenance at NASA to be written. And there's a guy at NASA named Zach Pertl who's been working on maintenance issues at NASA, including the history of it. And it's just fascinating. You know, like they had a difficult spacewalk to repair something. And then when they came back down, they built a robot just to do that repair again. So there's just, there's all kinds of fascinating stories at NASA about the history of maintenance there.
Lee, as you were talking, I was thinking about the high schools that are popping up that are focused on certain tracks, firefighters, whatnot. Thinking about shows like Dirty Jobs.
Yeah.
Are you going to take a look at culture now in terms of how we're trying to bring back into the fold? And I don't know if the right term is to give it its due respect again as maintenance. And there's such a high need for construction workers now.
Yeah.
I mean, the economy is really starting to swing in terms of the jobs that are available.
Yeah, there's this whole discussion going on in America right now about something they call the skills gap, which it's unclear how much of it is really exists and how much of it is a worry. But the idea is that there's a lot of jobs within companies that there's no skilled workers for. And what are those jobs? They're trade jobs, basically. And Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs has been one of the people who's really vocal about trying to get people more into training into those tracks. And I think that it's not just in the US and this is true, but I work at colleges, I stand up for colleges, but I think we have come to this false idea that you have to go to college to get a good job in our society, a good middle class job. And that's just not true. So I do think we need to think about community colleges and other kinds of training for these maintainers' jobs, which will give you a middle class existence for sure.
Any other questions? Yes. And then we'll come up here.
Thank you, Lee, for your talk. I have a question. I'm going to use Sears as an example. Sears is a really interesting company. I think we're going to more of it in the future. What is your thought on something innovating versus maintaining, succumbing to market forces and just dying off? So with Sears, they were an innovator. They were the original Amazon, but they failed to maintain. They literally put less of a priority on taking care of their stores and their customers. But then they also failed to innovate in terms of their product, and now they are basically having a slow bankruptcy. So I'm curious what your thought is on innovation versus maintenance, letting something go altogether.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to say that like we can look at capitalism and think like if we just think more about maintenance, that's the key to all problems, right? That would be silly. If I said to General Electric, what you should do is better maintain, that's not true, right? They still have to change their business processes to compete within capitalist systems. I do think often in companies there can be better maintenance done and better thinking about how to properly maintain processes. But I think that, you just described like the history of capitalism, which is firms come into being, sometimes they fall into laziness or just get comfortable or get bureaucratic, and then they get displaced. And I think that that'll continue. Yeah, and there's even people who ask like, how do we maintain innovation as a thing, right? That's a question. I'm like, okay, that's good. But I think that you're putting this is like just, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, described this process, and I think it's just true. Things get displaced, and it will always be true.
Thanks, Lee, for your talk. Very interesting. I just quick, maybe easy question, getting back to your point about the theme of social stratification in the history of maintenance. And so after rise of industrial capitalism, you can, I was wondering if in your own work or in your reading of other people's work in the maintainers vein, if you've noticed any sort of generalizable shifts in the social status of maintainers, and you can limit it to U.S. Context if you'd like.
No, thank you very much for asking that question. I actually have a whole section in this talk that usually touches on this issue. So what we see is like with mechanics and electricians and some other roles, those were originally high to medium high status roles. You wanted to be a mechanic in the 19th century. You wanted to be an electrician in the late 19th century. And then as technologies and industries age, those statuses go down in status, right? Those occupations go down in status. And I think that's a story tied to this market changes story. Yeah, the other one is right now coders. There was a really good piece in Wired about how everyone's telling their kids to be like CS majors because that's going to be the key to being a high status job in the future. It's like, which job are you going to get? Like, because a lot of them are going to be just working class jobs, basically, is the future. Yeah.
All right, Lee, thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And thank you for attending today's program. Don't forget next Thursday's talk. It'll be in the main reading room, August 16th, 7 p.m. And please join us across the hall in the History of Science Center. If you have additional questions or you want to see some of the material.
Some of the materials out there.
Professor Vinsel talked about, head across the hall. Just please put your coffee or drink and cookie on the table out there before you enter History of Science. So, thank you again.